Hi, welcome back to N64 Works. I know I said there was going to be a third part to the Super Mario 64 retrospective that explored the game's influence on Super Mario Odyssey, but that was contingent on a few things that didn't quite pan out. Hence the lack of a timely follow-up these past 2 years. Also, at this point, I've moved away from covering single games across multiple episodes, so let's just note that Super Mario Odyssey had an entire world set in Mario 64's castle area, and move along to the next game in the Nintendo 64 launch. Which is to say, the only other game at the N64 launch, Pilotwings 64. Between Super Mario 64 and Pilotwings 64 launching alongside the console on day one, you get a pretty clear sense of Nintendo's overall content strategy for the N64 system. That is to say, sticking to what worked on Super NES, while highlighting the new features made possible by N64's shift to 3D graphics. You can also get a sense, perhaps unintentionally, of some of the other changes that came hand in hand with the N64. For starters, there would be fewer games on N64 than there were on Super NES, and we can see that demonstrated here in the way only 2 titles appeared on the system at its American launch. Mario and Pilotwings paralleled 2 initial Super NES releases, of course, but they also made the missing games conspicuous in their absence. F-Zero wouldn't get a sequel until a few years into the N64's life, SimCity would only appear in Japan as a release for the 64DD add-on, and Gradius would actually skip N64 in favor of appearing at PlayStation 2's launch. Pilotwings 64 also comes to us thanks to a critical new element of Nintendo's business, one that represents a somewhat radical shift away from the first 10 years of the company's efforts in the game space: partnerships with Western studios. Nintendo had largely focused its products on the Japanese market, working with Japanese partners, but as they began to move into 3D, they took advantage of the cutting-edge resources available outside Japan. This facet of Nintendo's strategy actually began in the lead into the Super NES, as Nintendo brought members of British studio Argonaut in to consult on bringing 3D to the 16-bit console, an effort that resulted in the Super FX add-on chip family. The N64 represents the next step in those endeavors, as the console itself was co-designed with American engineers. Similarly, Pilotwings 64 was co-developed by Nintendo EAD and a Texas studio called Paradigm Simulations. Paradigm had extensive knowledge of the silicon graphics tech the N64 drew on. So just as Nintendo had tapped HAL and Satoru Iwata for their knowledge of the 6502 processor in the early days of the Famicom and NES, here they put Paradigm to work bringing Pilotwings into a proper 3D experience. And this is a fairly groundbreaking game. While Pilotwings was by no means the world's first 3D flight simulator, it plays unlike anything that had come before it. Pilotwings 64 walks, or flies, a strange line between intensely challenging and pleasantly low-key. Like its 16-bit predecessor, it demands much of players. Its challenges are structured similarly to the Super NES game, demanding players achieve stringent score objectives across a variety of flight-based challenges. Only by earning a target score in multiple tasks do you unlock the next tier of challenges. That said, Pilotwings 64 is much less frustrating than the first game. For one thing, challenges are grouped by vehicle type. The original Pilotwings used a multi-format approach that required aspiring pilots to complete tasks across several different vehicles consecutively. This gave the tests some variety, but also led to roadblocks for players who could ace one flight style but struggled with another. Here you have 3 columns of tests, 1 per vehicle type. Each test contains between 2 to 5 challenges, but every challenge within a specific test revolves around the same vehicle. You don't need to alternate between skills and controls with each takeoff. Instead, you can focus on a specific task. There's still plenty of variety within each vehicle type, so this really makes for a best of all worlds structure. Even better, the extremely strict score expectations of the original have been set aside. The Super NES game not only expected you to multitask, it offered very little margin for error. You needed to complete a set of challenges in a single attempt, with only a couple of opportunities to retry a task you whiffed beyond redemption. Here, however, you can tackle each event in a test category as many times as you need, in any order you like, until you succeed. Pilotwings 64's score tracking retains the highest score you achieve in each event separately, so there's no need to perform passingly in a single run, just so long as you eventually pass muster in each task at some point. This makes for a massively less hair-pulling experience, and it goes a long way toward underlining the profound sense of chill that Pilotwings 64 attempts to foster. Make no mistake though, the tasks you're expected to complete in Pilotwings 64 can be crushingly hard. This is not really a game you can complete in an evening, or even one you can master in a weekend. The flight challenges require practice, patience, and mastery. But the good news is that Pilotwings 64 is absolutely good-natured about it. and it's perfectly happy to let you take your time and just enjoy the experience. In fact, the first thing you unlock once you pass your 3 first-level tests is Birdman Mode, a free flight option that allows you to cartwheel around the various in-game environments. This is strictly a for-fun sandbox, an untimed stroll through the sky with no concrete goals and whose only fail state is crashing into the ground. In some senses, Pilotwings 64 plays like a breakout of Mario 64's flight sequences. Mario could don a winged cap and fly around many of the stages in his first 3D adventure, but his airtime was limited as he inevitably lost altitude and velocity. Pilotwings 64 features a hang glider that plays a great deal like Mario's winged escapades, but it also includes many forms of flight, most notably a gyrocopter and a jetpack. These vehicles handle differently than the hang glider. The rocket pack allows pinpoint accuracy, while the gyrocopter is essentially a light plane. Each vehicle delivers a distinct experience and requires its own specific skill set. The hang glider is extremely low-key, with flights largely consisting of making tiny nudges and adjustments until you reach a key test objective or need to hit an updraft to gain lift. The gyrocopter brings speed and versatility, allowing you to alter your course or direction far more quickly than the glider. And the jetpack makes it possible to hover, ascend, dart forward, or reverse course in a split second. Pilotwings 64 does a much better job of building varied challenges out of these abilities than its predecessor did. There are more than a dozen different challenges per vehicle to master, and many of them have their own standalone feel and requirements. The game starts with basic tasks, but before long you're taking on more involved duties. For instance, using missiles to destroy a rampaging robot. The game builds on itself, offering moderately useful explanations of each new mechanic, but ultimately expecting the player to put in the time to practice and master a given skill in order to graduate to the next scenario. For example, once you learn to land the hang glider, this becomes a secondary task, a part of your tool set. After you pull it off once, you're expected to be able to pull it off effortlessly every time in service of greater challenges. Pilotwings 64 also provides the player with a gameplay modifier in the form of different pilots. There are 6 different playable characters altogether, although in practice it might as well be 3. The pilots fall into different weight classes, light, medium, and heavy, that affect the performance of their vehicles. Each weight class has a male and female representative, but there's no significant difference between playing as, say, Kiwi instead of Lark. They're both lightweight pilots, which means they're better for hang gliders than heavyweights Hawk and Robin. These two characters don't offer any meaningful difference from one another. The pilots are all named after birds, which has the downside of changing the character who is very clearly meant to be Nestor to Lark, but it also has the upside of changing the busty later who was questionably called Hooter in Japan to the much more tasteful Robin.
Oh yeah.
Regardless of which character you play as, and you can swap among them between tests as you like, Pilotwings 64 somehow manages to be simultaneously brutal and relaxing. The fuzzy visuals and muted audio of the N64 combined with the frequently slow-paced nature of flight makes it a great game for chilling out. That said, Pilotwings 64 is a little hard to go back to nearly 25 years after its debut. As with many N64 games, this was a formative work that felt pretty revolutionary in its time, but countless games have followed in its wake and have improved on its controls, its tech, and its design. The low visual resolution and the single-stick control design that defined N64 make Pilotwings feel limited and clumsy compared to subsequent works, including its own sequel, Pilotwings Resort for Nintendo 3DS. It's not a bad game even now by any means, but the impact it had in 1996 has been diminished by time. Drifting through open 3D aerial spaces isn't quite so unique these days, and Pilotwings leans heavily on the novelty of something that isn't really novel anymore. This is a game that expects you to be engrossed by the simple fact of its existence, which in fairness was a perfectly valid approach at the dawn of the 3D era. Not so much anymore though. As if to prove the point, the main secondary task you're presented with throughout Pilotwings 64 is taking photos. Some stages revolve specifically around taking great photos, but most of the time you're free to simply snap a shot of a scene that catches your attention and save it permanently to the cartridge's memory. It's a neat feature that emphasizes creativity over violence, but it's hard to imagine anyone getting jazzed up over the chunky, blurry polygons that comprise Pilotwings 64's world these days. Still, even if time has marched on past Pilotwings 64, there's no denying it was a strong statement of intent. And in 1996, a lovely way to unwind between high-pressure attempts to capture some of Mario 64's more vexing stars. Super Mario 64 and Pilotwings 64 may have been the only games to ship alongside the N64 in the US, but in Japan there was a third game, set as Saikyo Habu Shogi. Of course there was a shogi game at the launch of a Japanese console, there always is. Saikyo Habu Shogi has earned a bit of infamy for being a sales disaster. The N64 didn't see anywhere near the kind of sales in Japan that the Super Famicom had enjoyed, and this game in particular took it on the chin. As of a couple of years ago, you could find new, sealed copies of Saikyo Habu Shogi stacked high in the clearance bins of Japanese used game shops for a few hundred yen a piece. That's like $2 or $3. It's not a game in high demand. That said, there's a lot more going on here than in all the portable shogi games I've been exploring on Game Boy. In fact, Saikyo Habu Shogi is the first game to use N64's uncommon high-resolution mode, outputting at, I think, 480i rather than 240p to provide an incredibly detailed view of the shogi board. There's no struggling to read kanji here. The graphics also make a subtle and effective use of 3D polygons, applying a very mild element of visual perspective to the affair by turning the shogi pieces into solid objects. With its double-resolution title screen and wealth of gameplay options, Saikyo Habu Shogi makes a great impression. I won't pretend to be able to offer some definitive statement on the state of shogi video games in 1996, but certainly compared to the portable versions we've seen, this is like upgrading from a rental sidewalk scooter to a Cadillac. This was clearly intended to be a sort of showcase for the N64, not just in terms of visual quality, but also for its processing power. The SGI-based hardware wasn't simply good for rendering 3D graphics, it was also great at performing other processing functions. Shogi games in particular had proven to be resource-hungry, as you might expect from a game similar in complexity to chess. We've already seen with Shogi for Game Boy and the Chess Master for Super NES how long it can take the CPU to calculate a strategic move when you're running on a 3 or 4 MHz chip. By the end of the Super NES's life, well, the Super Famicom's life, Saikyo Habu Shogi publisher Seta had begun shipping games that included special enhancement chips for their shogi titles. These were sort of like the Super FX chip, except that in pushing shaky polygons, they were assisting CPU calculations for shogi moves. The Seta line peaked with Hayazashi Nidan Morta Shogi 2, a 1995 release that included a 21 MHz ARM v3 coprocessor, basically an older version of the Game Boy Advance's CPU running 6 times faster than the Super NES's processor. As you can imagine, these games did not sell for cheap. While I can't dig up an exact figure for the Super Famicom release, the Lost Games Wiki claims a cancelled Famicom port was going to retail for nearly $150. The incredible selling point of Saikyo Habu Shogi then was that you didn't have to put a second mortgage on your home in order to play a great match of shogi against a virtual champion. The serious-looking fellow featured on the box was Habu Yoshiharu, who at the time of this game's release was 25 years old, yet simultaneously held 7 major shogi titles, which according to our pals at Wikipedia, is a feat that's never been matched. As usual, providing a comprehensive comparative breakdown of a shogi game is way beyond my pay grade, especially one this dense with options and screen display text that demands adult-level Japanese reading comprehension. Instead, I will simply say, it's a pretty neat demonstration of the N64's tech that applies the console advances in a different way than core gamers were interested to see in 1996. Also, it has a pretty bangin' title screen theme. Whenever the next N64 Works episode shows up, we'll look at the system's first post-launch title, a tech demo that I hope holds up a little better than Pilotwings 64.